my judges ready? All right, timer. Affirmative team? And Justin?
Yes.
All right. In this negative speech, I'm going to be going over the disadvantages of the Affirmative team's plan and showing you why their plan is actually going to be detrimental to both the market and the economy. So let's start off with disadvantage 1, which is of the market hurt. Market hurt. Now the subpoint A we're going to be looking at is market value. Market value. Now the reasons why market value is actually going to be decreased under the Affirmative team plan is from link 1. Link 1 is taxing the value of assets decreases value. Taxing the value of assets decreases value. From Clifford Asnes, PhD in finance from the University of Chicago, December 16, 2009. Quote, a transaction tax imposes a tax on the value of the assets. If such a tax really generates $150 billion per year, the value destruction might be in excess of $1 trillion in the $13 trillion U.S. equity market, end quote. Now what this piece of evidence is saying is that by imposing a transaction tax and raising revenue from this is going to be destroying the market and the value of all of the assets in the market because we are taxing the value of these assets. Link 2, or the second reason why market will be hurt, is the increased transaction costs equals lower asset value. Increased transaction costs equals lower asset value. From Jamin Kim, PhD in finance and associate professor of finance in 2010. Quote, an FTT needs an increase in transaction costs. An increase in transaction costs decreases liquidity in the market. A decrease in liquidity leads to an increase in the cost of capital. An increase in the cost of capital or the discount rate means a reduction in asset value, end quote. Now what the Affirmative team is doing is that they are raising transaction costs by implementing this financial transactions tax, and that is going to decrease market value by increasing the cost of capital. Now subpoint B is of market efficiency. Subpoint B, market efficiency. From Jamin Kim, PhD in finance and associate professor of finance, 2010. Quote, an increase in transaction costs will reduce market efficiency, end quote. Now what the Affirmative team is claiming to do is that they are going to actually increase market efficiency and help the market. What they're going to do is by imposing this tax on the market, they're actually going to decrease the value of assets in the market, increase transaction costs, and therefore hurt the overall market and the investors inside of it. So now let's look at another subpoint under this disadvantage, which is of liquidity. Subpoint C, liquidity. Now the Affirmative team claims that too much liquidity is actually bad for the markets, but that's not true. Liquidity is actually very good for the markets, and it's essential to a very healthy market. From the Adam Smith Institute, nonpartisan economic think tank based in Europe, November 2011. Quote, the FTT would reduce market liquidity in all securities markets, end quote. Now what the Affirmative team is doing is that by decreasing these high-frequency trades, the high-frequency traders are actually providing liquidity to the market. So by eliminating 50% of the market, as the Affirmative speaker said in cross-examination, we are eliminating all this liquidity and volume from the market. This is going to be detrimental to the market because we are chopping off half of it. That is a very bad thing to do, and it will be very detrimental to the market. So let's look at a few impacts of this. Impact 1 is of lower revenue. Lower revenue. Now when the market is hurt, less investors will be able to compete in the market and be in the market since it will be shrinking. So the investors in the market itself will be shrinking. So that means that the number of trades that the Affirmative teams will tax will be decreasing. This means that they will get less revenue because they're taxing less assets and less trades. So that's the first impact, which is lower revenue. The Affirmative team will not get their advantage of revenue because revenue will actually be lowered under their plan. Impact 2 is of market distortion. Market distortion. From Parasarathi Shom, PhD in economics, April 2011. Quote, the economic effects of FTT on capital markets are pervasive. They may impose significant efficiency costs by increasing the cost of capital to firms. The increase in cost could reduce investment and subsequently GDP growth, end quote. Now what we can see from this piece of evidence is that specifically investment and GDP will both decline under their plan. And investment and GDP are both very, very essential parts to the market. So with that declining, market value declining, and transaction costs going up, all these factors will get you to go into a hurt market. Now, that's the first disadvantage, is that the market will be extremely hurt under their plan. It will not be helped, it will only be hurt. And so for these reasons, I would ask you to vote against the negative team. But let's go into disadvantage 2, which is of the economy. Disadvantage 2, economy. Now the subpoint A is of jobs decline. Jobs will decline under the Affirmative team's plan. Again, from the Adam Smith Institute, November 2011. Quote, unemployment would rise if an FTT was introduced. At the margin, the FTT would mean less investment and less output, end quote. Again, we can see from this piece of evidence that there will be less investment in the economy. Now, when there's less investment, there's less jobs. When there's more investment, there's more jobs. What the Affirmative team does is that under their plan, they decrease investment, so this means there are less job opportunities in the United States. This means the jobs will actually decline under their plan. Subpoint B is of consumers hurt. Consumers will actually be hurt under their plan. Now, why this is because all these investors and these high-frequency traders will be bearing the cost of this tax, but they won't want to. So what they're going to do is they're going to pass the cost down to consumers in forms of higher wages or higher prices, or perhaps even laying people off. And that's another part where lost jobs come in. First, because there's less investment, and second, because the investors don't want to bear the brunt of the tax, so they pass it down to consumers by laying them off so they can get more money. So let's read this piece of evidence of Subpoint B of Consumers Hurt from Jamin Kim, PhD in Finance, 2010. Quote, taxing the transaction directly will affect individual investors. Undoubtedly, taxes on insurance premiums levied on financial institutions will eventually be passed on to their consumers to a varying degree. End quote. Now, what the Affirmative team is claiming is that their plan will not actually hurt ordinary long-term investors. But as you can see from this piece of evidence, clearly they will hurt long-term investors, and these long-term investors will pass the cost down to consumers. Now, what happens when consumers have less money, when they have lower wages or they have higher prices, or they've been laid off, they have a lot less money? What does this mean? This means that consumption is going to decrease. That's pretty simple. When consumers have less money, that means that they're going to buy less stuff and buy less things. So that's the impact one of consumption is decreased. Consumption is decreased. This is from Claes Cornell, who has a doctorate in economics, Roland Russ, PhD in business administration, and Market Deckenpeed, PhD and expert in economics from February 2010. Quote, of all economic activities, consumer spending is by far the most important is the most dominant contributor to U.S. economic growth. It accounts for approximately 2/3 of gross domestic product. In the U.S., economic growth is more dependent on consumer spending than any other country in the world. If consumer spending slows, the economy slows. If consumer spending drops even marginally, the economy is likely to contract, end quote. Now what we can see is that the Affirmative team's plan is actually going to hurt consumers. Less consumption will come about, and the economy will actually in turn be hurt by their plan, and GDP will decrease. Now let's look at an impact of GDP decrease. First off, when GDP is decreased, it just means the economy is shrinking. That overall is bad for everyone because the economy is worse. But another thing that will happen is the impact too of revenue offset. Revenue offset. Now GDP is directly correlated to revenue. So if GDP drops, this means that the revenue will also drop. From the Institute for Economic Affairs, an economic think tank based in Europe, November 2011. Quote, if we have a fall of GDP, we have a fall in tax revenue. The FTT is very difficult indeed to describe as an increase in tax revenue, end quote. And what we can see from the previous piece of evidence that I read is that consumer spending will slow, and consumer spending accounts for GDP. This means that GDP will drop, and because GDP is directly correlated to revenue, revenue will also drop. This means that the Affirmative team will not also get their advantage of deficit reduction. From these two points, we see that the revenue will actually be lower because the market will shrink and the economy will decrease because GDP will decrease. So for all these reasons, because the Affirmative team actually hurts the market and the economy, I'd ask for a negative value. Thank you.
All right, everybody ready? All our judges? All right. All right, let's begin. Hi, Mikayla. Congratulations on breaking at NITOC. That's pretty awesome.
You too. Thank you, Alex.
Thanks. So let's see. Let's just start off. You talked a lot about how GDP and investment was going to be decreased under our plan.
Yes.
Now, could you provide some quantification for that?
Quantification? Mm-hmm. I have some quantification numbers under a piece of evidence that I read that I didn't read out. Let me find it right there.
Okay, thank you. Do you mind if I ask another question?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, sweet. Thank you very much. Now, let's see. Just to reiterate, what is our highest tax rate, the highest rate that we tax?
0.5%.
0.5%. Okay. So, again, can we look back to my partner's analogy in the first cross-X? What is 0.5% of $10,000?
$50.
Right. So, right. So then, is that going to have a significant impact on long-term investors?
Yes, because this is a tax. So when you tax something, you're automatically going to get less of it. So even though these long-term investors aren't doing as many trades as high-frequency traders, it's still going to impede their trades.
Okay, so it's going to impede their trades even though it's so tiny in comparison to what they're trading that it really doesn't have any significant impact whatsoever.
It will have a significant impact, as we saw from my evidence and analysis.
All right, well, we'll be responding to that. But now can we look at some definitions? So first of all, can you define investment for me?
Investment? I don't exactly have a definition with me, but
Oh, you don't have to give like an actual definition, just define it in your own words.
people investing in bonds and stocks in the economy. I'm not completely sure of a definition.
All right, sure. And then another definition I wanted was efficiency. Can you define efficiency for me?
It being efficiency. Just trying to think of another word for efficiency. Basically, it being good or large or being easy to compete in. I guess.
So easy to compete in is your definition of efficiency?
Sure.
All right, thank you. So then let's see. Now, one other question I had was, can you quantify specifically how much we decrease volatility?
How much you decrease volatility?
Yes.
I don't believe you actually.
Or actually not, I'm sorry, liquidity.
Liquidity. I don't have a quantification with me, but as we can see, HFT provides a lot of liquidity, and you cut off half of the market.
Okay, but you don't have any quantification for exactly how much liquidity we lose.
Well, you're cutting off 50% of the market, so we could say that you lose 50% of liquidity.
Okay, and that actually leads to my next question. So would you agree that there's a difference between market volume and trade volume?
Yes.
Okay, so then do we get rid of half of the market volume or half of the trade volume with our plan?
Well, you get rid of half of the traders and half of the market volume.
So we get rid of half of the trade volume then?
And half of the market volume because half of the market is gone.
All right, can you define market volume, please?
I don't have a definition of market volume, but
All right. Well, we'll respond to all of these in our next speech, but I think that's all the questions I have, so thank you very much.
right, thank you.